Marcus Bennett stepped out of the black sedan, adjusting the simple gray sweater he had chosen that morning. It was deliberate. Every piece of clothing, every detail of his appearance had been calculated for today. He wanted to be underestimated. Today wasn't about flaunting wealth or status. Today was about seeing who these people truly were. His assistant, Amanda Brooks, walked beside him, her usual calm demeanor ever present. She handed him the final briefing papers. "They don't know you're coming, not as you, at least," she reminded him, glancing around the sleek, modern lobby of Howard Tech's towering headquarters. The stark white walls and pristine floors reflected a certain kind of coldness, matching perfectly with the rigid corporate culture he'd heard so much about. "Good," Marcus replied, his voice steady. He wasn't nervous. He had done this before. Step into a room, unnoticed, a shadow among giants who didn't know his worth until it was too late. Today would be no different. Howard Tech had sent several offers his way, none of which had impressed him. But it wasn't until he'd heard rumors about the company's lack of diversity and subtle racism that he decided to meet with them in person. As they approached the reception desk, Marcus noticed the dismissive glance the receptionist threw his way. She didn't even ask for his name, just stared at Amanda with the assumption that she was the important one. "Are you here for the delivery?" the receptionist asked, her eyes sliding past Marcus as though he were invisible. Amanda, without missing a beat, spoke firmly. "We're here for a meeting with Mr. Howard. Marcus Bennett is expected." The receptionist looked puzzled for a second, her brow furrowing as she typed quickly into her computer. "Bennett? I don't see anyone by that name on today's guest list," she muttered. "I assure you," Amanda replied sharply, "we have an appointment." The receptionist didn't respond, but instead pressed a button. Moments later, a security guard approached, a large man with a buzz cut and the typical air of authority. He barely glanced at Marcus before turning to Amanda. "You're here for the meeting on the 25th floor? Follow me." The guard led them to the elevator, his eyes still not registering Marcus's presence. Inside the mirrored walls of the lift, Marcus met Amanda's eyes. "It's already started," he said, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. The 25th floor conference room was larger than Marcus had expected, the walls lined with impressive trophies and accolades. It was clear Howard Tech was proud of its dominance in the tech world. Richard Howard, the company's CEO, stood at the head of the table, talking animatedly to a group of executives. All white, all men. They barely glanced up when Marcus and Amanda entered, though Richard's gaze lingered on Amanda for a moment longer. He mistook her for someone important. Marcus? Nothing more than an afterthought. "Please have a seat," Richard said, not bothering to introduce himself. He motioned vaguely toward a chair near the back of the room. It was an odd moment, the first sign of what would come. Marcus took the seat without hesitation. He was patient. As Richard began his presentation, an overview of Howard Tech's latest advancements in AI, Marcus leaned back slightly, observing. It wasn't the technology that interested him. It was the people, their reactions, their attitudes. None of them seemed to notice him, at least not in the way they should. "Any questions?" Richard finally asked, flipping through a series of slides about market share growth. Marcus cleared his throat, leaning forward. "I have one." All eyes turned to him, but Richard's glance was laced with impatience. "Yes?" he asked, barely masking his annoyance. "I'm curious about your approach to expanding internationally. How do you plan to tackle markets in Africa or South America?" Marcus asked, keeping his tone neutral but firm. Richard smirked. "Well, let's just say we're focusing on more profitable regions right now. Europe, North America, you know, where the real money is." The chuckle that rippled through the room was enough to send a chill down Marcus's spine. But he stayed calm, his expression unreadable. It wasn't the first time he had witnessed this sort of arrogance, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. "I see," Marcus replied, sitting back again, his fingers lightly tapping the table. He could feel Amanda's tension beside him. She knew what was coming. As the meeting dragged on, Richard's condescending remarks became harder to ignore. He even interrupted Marcus once more, this time to ask Amanda if she could get everyone some coffee. It took every ounce of control for Marcus not to react, But Amanda remained professional, simply responding with, "I'm here for the meeting, not catering." That earned her a surprised look from Richard. Clearly, he wasn't used to being corrected. Peter Carlson, one of the executives who had been sitting quietly throughout the meeting, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His eyes darted between Marcus and Richard. Marcus could tell Peter didn't share his boss's confidence, but fear kept him silent. It was the story of so many like him, people caught in the middle of moral compromise and professional survival. Marcus caught Peter's eye for a brief moment, giving him a slight nod, but Peter quickly looked away. The meeting was nearing its end when Amanda's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her face suddenly pale. Without a word, she stood and handed Marcus a folder that had just been delivered by a courier. Marcus nodded, opening the folder slowly, revealing the papers that would turn the tide of the day. As Marcus flipped through the pages, Richard droned on about profit margins and market expansion, oblivious to what was happening just a few feet away. Finally, Marcus closed the folder with a soft thud, catching Richard's attention. "Mr. Howard," Marcus said, standing slowly. Richard paused mid-sentence, clearly surprised. "Yes?" Without raising his voice, Marcus held the folder out to him. "You might want to take a look at this." Richard frowned, but accepted the folder. His eyes scanned the papers quickly, his face slowly draining of color as realization hit him. The room fell into an awkward silence as Richard finally looked up from the documents, meeting Marcus's calm, unwavering gaze. "You're Marcus Bennett." Richard's voice cracked slightly. His confident demeanor crumbled in an instant, leaving behind only a man scrambling to recover from a grave misjudgment. The air in the room grew heavy as the other executives exchanged uneasy glances. Peter Carlson's face was a mixture of shock and regret, but he said nothing. "Yes," Marcus replied simply, his voice steady as ever. The shift in Richard's behavior was almost immediate as he tried to regain control of the situation. I didn't realize," he stammered, his once confident voice now laced with desperation. "If I had known." "Known what?" Marcus interrupted, his tone now carrying a subtle but firm edge. "Known that I wasn't someone to dismiss?" Richard's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The weight of the moment settled heavily on his shoulders, his previously smug expression replaced by one of pure panic. The room was thick with tension, no one daring to move or speak. Peter Carlson looked as though he wanted to say something, his face red with embarrassment, but he remained silent. Everyone else in the room was frozen, waiting for what would come next. "I think," Marcus said, breaking the silence, "we've seen enough." He looked toward Amanda, who was already gathering her things. "This meeting is over." Marcus didn't wait for a response as he turned and walked toward the door, Amanda following closely behind. But just before exiting, Marcus paused and looked back at Richard, whose face was a mask of disbelief. "The problem with people like you," Marcus said quietly, "is that you only respect power when it's in front of you. Today, you lost much more than an investment. You lost your integrity." And with that, Marcus and Amanda left the room, leaving behind a silence that screamed louder than any words ever could. The door to the conference room closed with a barely audible click behind Marcus and Amanda. For a moment, the room was steeped in an oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of Richard Howard flipping through the documents in his hands. The air was thick with disbelief, and the expressions around the table ranged from confusion to discomfort. Marcus had barely taken his seat again when Richard's voice cut through the tension. "So, Mr. Bennett." Richard paused, clearly grasping for a way to salvage the situation. "I apologize if I wasn't, well, if things didn't start off properly." His voice, thick with embarrassment, lacked the usual confidence. He forced a tight-lipped smile, an attempt to mask his unease. "Had I known it was you, I would have—" "You would have what?" Marcus interrupted, his voice calm but sharp. The question lingered in the air like a challenge, and Richard visibly recoiled from its weight. "I just meant—" "Look, Marcus," Richard said, trying for a more familiar tone, as if a casual approach would smooth over his earlier condescension. "I didn't recognize you, that's all. Let's not dwell on it. Let's get to the heart of this deal." But Marcus wasn't ready to let him off the hook so easily. Recognition, he said slowly, deliberately, isn't what this is about, Richard. You assumed something about me the moment I walked into this room, didn't you? Richard's mouth opened, but no response came. Marcus didn't need to hear an answer. He already knew it. Peter Carlson, sitting 2 seats away, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had been a silent observer for most of the meeting, but the growing tension now had him nervously tugging at his shirt collar. His mind raced with thoughts of the consequences that could follow from today's disastrous turn of events. Peter stole a glance at Marcus, who remained composed and unyielding. There was something both unsettling and admirable about the man's calm in the face of such blatant disrespect. Richard, clearly sensing the pressure, tried to regain some semblance of control. "Look," he began, leaning forward, his tone now more aggressive. "I don't see why we're getting off track. What happened earlier was a misunderstanding. But let's focus on the partnership, on the business. Howard Tech is ready for expansion. We have a solid plan, and with your backing, we can." "Is that how you run this company, Richard?" Marcus interrupted again, his voice still measured but with a steel edge. "By dismissing people before they've had the chance to speak? By making assumptions about who deserves your attention and respect based on nothing but appearances?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Richard's fingers twitched nervously, tapping against the table as he struggled to maintain his composure. "It's not like that," he mumbled, his gaze flickering to the other executives at the table, searching for support. The other men remained silent, none of them daring to meet his eyes. The weight of the moment pressed down on them all, and no one was willing to step into the firing line. Marcus sighed, his frustration barely concealed. "This isn't just about me, Richard," he said, leaning forward. "It's about how you lead. It's about the culture you've built here. If you can treat me this way, how do you think your staff is treated? Your clients? Your partners?" "I don't have a problem with my staff," Richard replied quickly, the defensiveness in his voice undeniable. "My employees are happy here. We have a solid team." Amanda, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. "Have you asked them, Richard?" Her voice was firm, and her gaze unflinching as she locked eyes with the CEO. "Have you ever stopped to ask how they feel, or are you assuming that silence equals satisfaction?" The question caught Richard off guard, and he hesitated for just a moment too long. His silence was answer enough. Peter, feeling the growing pressure, glanced nervously at Richard before speaking. Mr. Bennett," he began, his voice shaky. I don't think that's entirely fair. I mean, Richard has always been supportive of his team. Has he?" Marcus turned his attention to Peter now, his gaze piercing. "And how do you feel, Peter? Sitting here, knowing how this meeting started? Knowing that Richard dismissed me because of a snap judgment, because I didn't look the part?" Peter's face flushed red as all eyes in the room turned to him. He stammered, unsure of how to respond. I mean, it wasn't right, of course, but... Marcus pressed, his voice deceptively calm. Peter swallowed hard. He could feel the sweat gathering at the back of his neck. "But that's just the way things are here," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The confession hung in the air like a lead weight. Marcus watched Peter for a long moment before speaking again. "And is that the kind of environment you want to be part of?" Peter didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said enough. Richard's patience was wearing thin. He had tried to play it smooth, tried to brush off the earlier humiliation, but now it felt as though the entire meeting was slipping out of his control. The worst part? The realization that the man sitting across from him, the one he had belittled and dismissed, was not only unimpressed with Howard Tech's grand plans, but was calling into question everything Richard thought he knew about running a business. "I didn't bring you here for a lecture on ethics, Marcus," Richard finally snapped, his voice taut with frustration. "I thought you were a businessman, someone who understands the bottom line." "I am a businessman," Marcus replied coolly, "and this is the bottom line. Your company's culture is toxic. You can't build lasting success on a foundation of arrogance and prejudice." Richard's face twisted into a sneer. "Is this some kind of social experiment to you? You come in here, dress down, and wait for someone to make a mistake so you can feel superior?" Marcus remained calm. I came here hoping for a partnership, he said evenly. But I don't invest in companies that don't reflect my values. You showed me who you were the moment I walked through that door. And who's that, exactly? Richard scoffed, crossing his arms defiantly. A man who can't see past his own privilege, Marcus answered without hesitation. A man who thinks his position gives him the right to look down on others. The room grew even more tense, the silence pressing in like a physical weight. Amanda, sensing that the confrontation was reaching its climax, rose from her chair. We've seen enough, she said, gathering her papers. Richard looked between them, anger flashing in his eyes. You're really going to walk away from this? From an opportunity to be part of something huge? Marcus stood as well, his towering presence commanding attention. I don't walk away from opportunities, Richard. I walk away from liabilities. The words stung, and Richard's face flushed with fury. He had expected to win Marcus over, to secure a deal that would propel Howard Tech into new markets. But now, he was watching it all slip away. As Marcus and Amanda headed toward the door, Peter suddenly found his voice. Wait, he called out, his tone desperate. Please, can't we fix this? Isn't there something we can do? Marcus paused, his hand on the door handle, and turned to face Peter. There was a flicker of compassion in his eyes, but it was tempered with resolve. This isn't something you can fix with a quick apology, Peter, he said quietly. It's a systemic issue, one that won't change overnight. Peter's face fell, the weight of his complicity finally sinking in. He nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. With that, Marcus and Amanda left the room, leaving behind an air of stunned silence and a group of men who, for the first time, were forced to confront the consequences of their arrogance. Marcus and Amanda strode out of the conference room, the tension of the past hour weighing heavy in the air behind them. The door's echo had barely faded before the room exploded in a flurry of whispered conversations and hushed panic. Richard Howard stood motionless, staring at the door, his hands still resting on the back of his chair. For a moment, it was as though time had frozen, trapping him in the realization of what had just slipped through his fingers. Slowly, the voices of the other executives began to pierce his mental fog. Is this real? Peter Carlson muttered, half to himself and half to the room. Did we just blow it? Richard turned sharply, his face red with fury. Shut up, Peter, he snapped. His voice, however, betrayed his growing sense of desperation. We haven't lost anything yet. There's still a chance to fix this. But how? One of the younger executives asked, his voice cracking slightly. He walked out. He hesitated, lowering his voice. We were all complicit in treating him like an assistant. Richard's eyes darted around the room, searching for an answer that wasn't there. He wanted to blame someone, anyone, for how this had unfolded. This isn't over, he growled, more to convince himself than the others. In the hallway, Marcus and Amanda walked in silence, but their thoughts raced. Marcus's face was unreadable, a calm exterior hiding a storm of reflection. Amanda, always perceptive, broke the silence. Do you think he'll try to fix this? I mean, he has to know the damage is done, she said, her voice measured but curious. Marcus gave a slight nod. He'll try, he replied. Men like Richard don't give up easily. He's more worried about his image and his company than doing the right thing. Amanda looked at Marcus carefully, her mind already working through the next steps. So, what's next? Are we really walking away from this? Howard Tech has potential. Marcus stopped walking and turned to face her. His expression softened, but there was resolve in his eyes. Potential without values is nothing, he said quietly. We don't need them, Amanda. We can find a company that isn't built on arrogance and prejudice. She sighed, understanding his point, but knowing the difficulties that lay ahead. There aren't many companies out there that align with what we're looking for. I know, Marcus admitted, starting to walk again, but I'd rather invest in something small and ethical than something big and rotten. Amanda nodded silently, her mind racing with thoughts of the business world they inhabited, one so often defined by compromise. Back in the conference room, the atmosphere was growing more chaotic. Richard, pacing back and forth, began barking orders. Get his contact information. He shouted. I don't care what it takes. Find a way to get him back in here. Peter, sitting closest to the door, watched Richard with growing unease. Richard, he ventured, his voice cautious, do you really think that's going to work? He's a billionaire. He doesn't need us. Richard froze mid-step, glaring at Peter. We need him, he said coldly. Without Bennett's investment, we're looking at a slower growth rate, losing leverage on our competitors. You want to be the one to tell the shareholders that? Peter looked down, shaking his head. No, but... Then fix it, Richard demanded, slamming his hand on the table. His eyes burned with anger, but underneath, there was something else, fear. He could already feel the balance of power shifting, the control slipping through his hands. One of the other executives, a man named Jeff, finally spoke up. What if he doesn't come back? What if we lost him for good? Richard turned his cold gaze to Jeff, and for a moment, the entire room held its breath. Then we'll make sure that he regrets walking away from us, Richard said, his voice low but dangerous. We'll make sure Howard Tech rises without him. Peter flinched at the harshness in Richard's tone. He had always known his boss could be ruthless, but this felt different. The desperation, the arrogance, it was all spiraling out of control. He wondered how long it would be before Richard took things too far. Later that evening, Marcus sat in the quiet of his penthouse, the lights of the city glowing faintly in the distance. He held a glass of bourbon in his hand, swirling the amber liquid as he reflected on the day's events. Amanda was sitting across from him, her laptop open as she finalized notes from their recent meetings. She paused, looking up at him with a question in her eyes. Marcus, are you really at peace with how it ended? She asked carefully. I know we've faced worse, but today felt personal. Marcus took a slow sip of his drink before responding. It's always personal, Amanda. That's what people like Richard never understand. They think it's just business, but when you treat people the way he does, it becomes about more than numbers. Amanda nodded, absorbing his words. Still, she continued, he'll come after us. You know that, right? Howard Tech isn't going to sit quietly and let you walk away. They're going to make this harder than it needs to be. The question hung in the air, unanswered. Richard's fingers twitched nervously, tapping against the table as he struggled to maintain his composure. It's not like that, he mumbled, his gaze flickering to the other executives at the table, searching for support. The other men remained silent, none of them daring to meet his eyes. The weight of the moment pressed down on them all, and no one was willing to step into the firing line. Marcus sighed, his frustration barely concealed. This isn't just about me, Richard, he said, leaning forward. It's about how you lead. It's about the culture you've built here. If you can treat me this way, how do you think your staff is treated? Your clients? Your partners? I don't have a problem with my staff, Richard replied quickly, the defensiveness in his voice undeniable. My employees are happy here. We have a solid team. Amanda, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. Have you asked them, Richard? Her voice was firm, and her gaze unflinching as she locked eyes with the CEO. Have you ever stopped to ask how they feel, or are you assuming that silence equals satisfaction? The question caught Richard off guard, and he hesitated for just a moment too long. His silence was answer enough. Peter, feeling the growing pressure, glanced nervously at Richard before speaking. Mr. Bennett, he began, his voice shaky. I don't think that's entirely fair. I mean, Richard has always been supportive of his team. Has he? Marcus turned his attention to Peter now, his gaze piercing. And how do you feel, Peter? Sitting here, knowing how this meeting started? Knowing that Richard dismissed me because of a snap judgment, because I didn't look the part? Peter's face flushed red as all eyes in the room turned to him. He stammered, unsure of how to respond. I mean, it wasn't right, of course, but... Marcus pressed, his voice deceptively calm. Peter swallowed hard. He could feel the sweat gathering at the back of his neck. But that's just the way things are here, he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The confession hung in the air like a lead weight. Marcus watched Peter for a long moment before speaking again. And is that the kind of environment you want to be part of? Peter didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said enough. Richard's patience was wearing thin. He had tried to play it smooth, tried to brush off the earlier humiliation, but now it felt as though the entire meeting was slipping out of his control. The worst part? The realization that the man sitting across from him, the one he had belittled and dismissed, was not only unimpressed with Howard Tech's grand plans, but was calling into question everything Richard thought he knew about running a business. "I didn't bring you here for a lecture on ethics, Marcus," Richard finally snapped, his voice taut with frustration. "I thought you were a businessman, someone who understands the bottom line." "I am a businessman," Marcus replied coolly, "and this is the bottom line. Your company's culture is toxic. You can't build lasting success on a foundation of arrogance and prejudice." Richard's face twisted into a sneer. "Is this some kind of social experiment to you? You come in here, dress down, and wait for someone to make a mistake so you can feel superior?" Marcus remained calm. "I came here hoping for a partnership," he said evenly, "but I don't invest in companies that don't reflect my values. You showed me who you were the moment I walked through that door." "And who's that, exactly?" Richard scoffed, crossing his arms defiantly. "A man who can't see past his own privilege," Marcus answered without hesitation. "A man who thinks his position gives him the right to look down on others." The room grew even more tense, the silence pressing in like a physical weight. Amanda, sensing that the confrontation was reaching its climax, rose from her chair. "We've seen enough," she said, gathering her papers. Richard looked between them, anger flashing in his eyes. "You're really going to walk away from this? From an opportunity to be part of something huge?" Marcus stood as well, his towering presence commanding attention. "I don't walk away from opportunities, Richard. I walk away from liabilities." The words stung, and Richard's face flushed with fury. He had expected to win Marcus over, to secure a deal that would propel Howard Tech into new markets. But now, he was watching it all slip away. As Marcus and Amanda headed toward the door, Peter suddenly found his voice. "Wait," he called out, his tone desperate. "Please, can't we fix this? Isn't there something we can do?" Marcus paused, his hand on the door handle, and turned to face Peter. There was a flicker of compassion in his eyes, but it was tempered with resolve. "This isn't something you can fix with a quick apology, Peter," he said quietly. "It's a systemic issue, one that won't change overnight." Peter's face fell, the weight of his complicity finally sinking in. He nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. With that, Marcus and Amanda left the room, leaving behind an air of stunned silence and a group of men who, for the first time, were forced to confront the consequences of their arrogance. Marcus's expression darkened slightly. "Let him try. I've been underestimated before, and I've survived. Richard Howard is nothing new." Amanda closed her laptop and leaned back, watching him closely. "Do you ever get tired of fighting?" she asked softly. Marcus looked at her, his eyes reflecting the years of struggle and success. "Yes," he admitted after a long pause. "But it's a fight worth having." They sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of their decisions settling between them. Amanda finally broke the silence, her voice determined. "Then we fight. And we make sure Richard knows we're not going to back down." Marcus smiled slightly, appreciating her loyalty and strength. "We will. And we'll do it on our terms." As the night wore on, the phone in Marcus's penthouse rang, breaking the stillness. Amanda, ever efficient, answered it quickly. "Mr. Bennett's office," she said, her tone professional. There was a pause as the voice on the other end spoke. Her eyes flicked to Marcus, a knowing look passing between them. "Yes, I'll let him know," she said before hanging up. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Richard?" "Of course," Amanda replied, standing up and walking toward him. "He wants a second chance. He's offering to meet, privately, to fix things." Marcus laughed, a short, humorless sound. "He's panicking." Amanda nodded. "And he'll keep trying until you say yes. What do you want to do?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes focused on the skyline beyond the glass walls of his penthouse. He knew this game all too well, knew the moves Richard was about to make. "We're not meeting him," Marcus said decisively. "He had his chance." Amanda nodded in agreement, but before she could respond, Marcus spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "But we're not done with him yet. Amanda's eyes flickered with curiosity. What do you mean? Marcus set his glass down on the table and stood, his mind already working through the next steps. Richard wants to play hardball. Let's show him what happens when you go up against someone who knows how to fight back. The following morning, Howard Tech's board convened for an emergency meeting. Richard, now fully aware of how close they were to disaster, stormed into the room, his face a mask of fury. We need to secure a new investor now, he barked at his team. Find me options, fast. Peter Carlson sat quietly, his mind racing. Something about this felt wrong, desperate. He had always admired Richard's ambition, but today it felt like arrogance, the kind that could destroy everything. Peter raised his hand slowly, speaking cautiously. Maybe we should slow down, Richard. Think this through. Bennett didn't walk out for nothing. Richard glared at him. What's there to think about? He's just another billionaire who thinks he's above us. He can be replaced. Peter's stomach twisted. He could feel the tension rising, the sense that Richard was pushing them toward a line they couldn't uncross. He swallowed hard, choosing his next words carefully. Or maybe, Peter said quietly, we need to reflect on why he walked out in the first place. For a moment, the room fell silent. Richard's eyes locked on Peter, cold and unforgiving. What exactly are you suggesting, Peter? Peter's heart raced, but he held his ground. I'm suggesting that we think about the culture we've built here, about how we've treated people. Maybe this is our chance to. Richard cut him off with a sharp laugh. Culture, he scoffed. This is about money, Peter, not a social experiment. If you don't have the stomach for it, maybe you're in the wrong business. Peter's face flushed with embarrassment, but he didn't back down. Maybe I am, he muttered under his breath, though Richard didn't hear him. The meeting continued, but Peter knew in his heart that something had shifted. And soon, they would all have to face the consequences. The morning after Marcus's decisive exit, the atmosphere at Howard Tech was bleak. The entire office was buzzing with whispers. No one had yet dared to confront Richard Howard about what had happened in the boardroom, but the tension was palpable. There was no avoiding the looming crisis. The company had lost one of the most significant investment opportunities it had ever seen. Richard's office was eerily silent. He sat behind his large, mahogany desk, staring blankly at his phone. He had left 3 voicemails for Marcus, each one more desperate than the last. He hated how vulnerable he sounded in them, how he had practically begged for another meeting, but all his calls went unanswered. Marcus Bennett, it seemed, had made his decision. Richard glared at him, his jaw tight. He walked away because he's arrogant, just like the rest of them. They think they can judge us, judge me, and walk off like it's nothing. Peter shook his head, summoning the courage to push back. No, Richard. He walked away because of how you treated him. And until we acknowledge that, we're not going to fix anything. Richard's face darkened. Are you saying this is my fault? I'm saying that we've built a culture here that pushes people away, Peter replied, his voice steady but firm. If we don't change that, we're going to keep losing out on opportunities like this. Richard's fists clenched, but before he could respond, Jeff spoke up. Peter's right. We can't keep pretending like everything's fine. We need to rebuild trust, not just with investors, but within the company. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Richard stood at the head of the table, his eyes cold and calculating. For a moment, it seemed like he might explode, but instead, he let out a bitter laugh. You want to rebuild trust? Fine, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But trust doesn't pay the bills. I'm not interested in holding hands and singing Kumbaya. We need results. Peter exchanged a look with Jeff, both of them realizing how deep Richard's denial ran. This was going to be harder than they thought. The days that followed saw a dramatic shift in the business world. News spread quickly that Marcus Bennett had walked away from Howard Tech, and rumors began to circulate about why. Some speculated it was a simple business disagreement, while others whispered about something deeper, an issue of integrity and values. Then came the announcement that Marcus had chosen to invest in a smaller tech company, one that had long been considered an underdog in the industry. The headlines were clear: Billionaire Marcus Bennett partners with Innovate Tech, a move for ethical leadership. At Howard Tech, the fallout was immediate. Clients began to question their loyalty, wondering if they should follow Marcus's lead. Shareholders demanded answers, pushing Richard into a corner. In the conference room, Richard sat at the head of the table, staring at the latest reports with disbelief. "This can't be happening," he muttered under his breath. Peter, standing at the far end of the room, watched as Richard's empire began to crumble. It was clear now. There was no salvaging the situation unless Richard was willing to change. And Peter wasn't sure that day would ever come. Back in his office, Marcus watched the headlines roll in. Amanda sat across from him, a satisfied smile on her face. "You did it," she said softly. "You sent the message." Marcus nodded but didn't speak. He knew this was only the beginning. The real work, changing the culture of business, was still ahead. The following weeks after Marcus Bennett's departure from Howard Tech were anything but quiet. The fallout was felt not just within the walls of Richard Howard's company, but across the industry. Howard Tech's stock value dipped, investors grew restless, and clients began reconsidering their long-term partnerships. The company, once seen as untouchable, now looked vulnerable. Richard sat in his office, staring blankly at the latest financial reports. The red numbers glaring back at him felt like a personal insult, a reminder of everything slipping out of his grasp. His hand clenched around the edge of his desk, knuckles white with tension. For the first time in his career, he felt powerless. A knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Richard barked, his voice sharp, tinged with frustration. The door creaked open, and Peter Carlson stepped inside, looking hesitant. He hadn't spoken much to Richard since the disastrous meeting with Marcus, but today, he couldn't avoid it any longer. The situation was spiraling, and someone had to confront the uncomfortable truth. "Richard, we need to talk," Peter began, trying to keep his tone measured. "The board is getting anxious. We need to address the situation." Richard didn't look up from his desk. "I'm handling it." With all due respect, Peter continued, his voice gaining strength, "It doesn't look like you're handling anything. We're losing clients. The media is tearing us apart. The board is talking about restructuring." Richard slammed his fist on the desk, finally looking up, eyes blazing with anger. "I said I'm handling it," he snapped. "We've been through rough patches before. This is no different." Peter took a deep breath. "This is different, Richard. We lost Marcus Bennett, and with him, we lost credibility. The way you treated him," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "it wasn't just a business misstep. It was personal. People are starting to see Howard Tech for what it is, a company that doesn't respect its partners." Richard scoffed, shaking his head. "Don't give me that moral high ground speech, Peter. This is business. Bennett is just another investor." "He's more than that," Peter countered, his voice steady but firm. "He's a symbol. And now, the way you handled things with him is a symbol of everything wrong with how this company is run. We need to change, or we're going to lose more than just a few clients." Richard's jaw clenched, the tension in the room thickening. He hated the idea of admitting fault, hated the thought of having to bend to anyone else's will. "So what's your solution then?" he spat bitterly. "You want me to apologize? To what? Beg Bennett to come back?" Peter sighed, shaking his head. "It's not about Bennett coming back, Richard. It's about looking at the culture you've built here. People are leaving because they don't feel respected. Investors are leaving because they don't trust us anymore. If you don't acknowledge that, we'll keep bleeding." Richard stared at Peter for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes cold and calculating. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said dismissively. "This company is fine. Bennett walked away because he's arrogant, not because of how we treat people." Peter felt his frustration bubbling over. "You're wrong," he said firmly. "And if you don't see that, then maybe you're not the right person to be leading Howard Tech." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Richard's eyes narrowed. For a moment, it seemed like he might explode, but instead, he leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "Watch yourself, Peter. You might want to think about your place in this company before you start throwing around ultimatums." Peter didn't flinch. "I already have," he said quietly before turning and leaving the office, the tension in the air lingering long after the door clicked shut. Across town, Marcus sat in the conference room of Innovate Tech, the company he had chosen to partner with after walking away from Howard Tech. The energy in the room was entirely different from the cold, transactional atmosphere of Richard's boardroom. Here, the executives greeted Marcus with genuine smiles, eager to discuss not just numbers but ideas, values, and vision. Amanda sat beside him, her notebook open, jotting down notes as the meeting progressed. "So, we're excited to move forward with this partnership," the CEO of Innovate Tech, Claire Evans, said, her voice warm and confident. "We believe that our shared commitment to innovation and inclusivity will make this a powerful alliance." Marcus nodded, pleased with what he had seen so far. Innovate Tech was smaller than Howard Tech, but what it lacked in size, it made up for in integrity and vision. The company had a reputation for treating its employees well, for fostering creativity and collaboration, and most importantly, for valuing diversity in a way that felt authentic. "I'm glad to hear that, Claire," Marcus replied, his tone thoughtful. "What we're building here is more than just a business partnership. It's about setting an example for the industry. We want to show that companies can be both profitable and principled." Claire smiled, clearly in agreement. "Absolutely. And with your backing, I think we can really shake things up." After the meeting ended, Marcus and Amanda lingered in the conference room, going over the details of the partnership. "How are you feeling about this one?" Amanda asked, her eyes scanning Marcus's expression. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a satisfied look on his face. "This is the right move," he said confidently. "We're building something real here, and Howard Tech is going to feel the impact." Amanda smiled. "Speaking of Howard Tech, have you seen the latest headlines?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, curious. "No. What's happening now?" She slid her phone across the table to him, the headline of a business article glowing on the screen. "Howard Tech faces leadership crisis amidst investor exodus." Marcus read the article in silence, his expression unreadable. The article detailed how Howard Tech was scrambling to recover after Marcus's departure, with investors pulling out and employees speaking up about the toxic culture within the company. Richard Howard, the article noted, was struggling to maintain control. Amanda watched him carefully. "It looks like the cracks are starting to show." Marcus set the phone down and nodded. They were always there. It was just a matter of time before they became impossible to ignore. Amanda hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Do you think he'll ever change?" "Richard, I mean." Marcus looked thoughtful for a moment, then shook his head. "People like Richard don't change unless they're forced to. And even then, it's usually too late." At Howard Tech, the pressure continued to mount. Peter Carlson found himself increasingly isolated within the company. Richard's refusal to acknowledge the growing crisis left Peter with a choice to make. He could continue to sit back and watch the company fall apart, or he could make the difficult decision to leave. One afternoon, as Peter sat in his office, a resignation letter half-written on his computer screen, he received an email from Marcus Bennett's team. It was an invitation to discuss potential opportunities at Innovate Tech, a chance to work with a company that valued the things Peter had always believed in: integrity, collaboration, and respect. Peter stared at the email for a long time, his mind racing. He thought about the years he had spent at Howard Tech, the sacrifices he had made to climb the corporate ladder, the moments of compromise that had left him feeling hollow. And then he thought about the future, about the kind of leader he wanted to be, about the kind of company he wanted to be part of. With a deep breath, Peter made his decision. He hit save on the resignation letter and closed his laptop. It was time to move on. Marcus sat in his office, overlooking the city skyline as the sun began to set. His phone buzzed with a message from Amanda. "Just heard from Peter. He's ready to make the switch." Marcus smiled to himself. Another piece of the puzzle was falling into place. Innovate Tech was growing stronger, and Howard Tech was learning the hard way that leadership wasn't just about power and control. It was about people. As the evening light bathed the city in gold, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He had faced prejudice, arrogance, and greed, but he had never lost sight of his values. And now, as he looked toward the future, he knew that the work he was doing, building companies that valued both people and profit, was more important than ever. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt a deep sense of peace.